By now, we've been through the microscopic structure and physiology of muscle, and we've looked at how the nervous system directs muscle movement. In this video, the next to the last one for this topic, by the way, we will look at the types of muscle contractions, muscle fibers, and we'll begin to look at the effects of exercise on muscle structure. By the end of this video, you should be able to distinguish among the different types of muscle contractions. These include your isometric, isotonic concentric, and isotonic eccentric contractions. You should be able to distinguish among the different types of muscle fibers, and you should be able to describe the effects of exercise on muscle fibers. Earlier in this chapter, we talked about how skeletal muscle contractions are voluntary. We said this means that somewhere in your brain, you consciously think about the movements that you want to make, and your nervous system coordinates the electrical impulses to contract your muscles at the right times and make that movement happen. But would it surprise you to know that while that's true, your muscles are also always partially contracted, even when you're exhausted and you're laying in your bed relaxing every one of your muscles? This partial contraction is called muscle tone. Muscle tone originates with the action potentials from your spinal cord. These action potentials activate your motor units alternately in response to special mechanoreceptors that detect stretching in your muscles. This allows some muscles to contract while others relax. Muscle tone is essential for your posture, for the stabilization of your joints, and it helps with heat production. It keeps your muscles primed for movement. Good muscle tone helps keep your skeletal muscles firm, healthy, and ready to respond to a stimulus to contract. In addition to muscle tone, there are contractions that our muscles make to oppose a load or to push or pull an object that needs to be moved. There are two types of contraction responsible for this work. Isotonic contractions occur when muscles generate tension while changing their length in response to a load. The best way that I can describe this topic is to talk about my brief foray into lifting weights a couple of years ago. I started working out at my Y with a trainer, and it was a challenge to say the least, but I enjoyed it and I could see myself getting stronger as the months went by. One day, my trainer introduced me to a Smith machine, and he asked me to start doing pull-ups, kind of like what you see in this animation from Spark People. Now, while I did this exercise, my biceps muscles had to shorten in order to bring my torso up to the bar. This type of movement is called an isotonic concentric contraction. I had to overcome the weight of my torso for this movement to happen, so my torso would be the load. And during an isotonic concentric contraction, a muscle shortens, but it's able to generate enough tension to exceed the load. A few months later, my trainer was going to help me build strength to be able to do a chin-up. Now, a little something about me, I was chunky as a kid and could never do chin-ups during PE, so I was hoping to be able to do it as an adult. He helped me into an assisted pull-up machine, and he adjusted the weight to help lift my body up into a chin-up. So this is what that looked like. So the weights, you can kind of see them over here on the side, moving up and down. They counterbalance the weight of the body and help push your body up. Well, that's what was supposed to happen. I used an isotonic concentric contraction to get my body, basically my chin, up to the bar. But then my trainer released some of the weight that was holding me up. There quickly came a point at which, despite my resistance to it, I started sinking down slowly. I contracted my muscles to try to keep from falling off the machine, but I couldn't hold myself up. I could not overcome the load in this case, so the load would have been the weight of my body. My body was too heavy, and my muscles were not strong enough. So my muscles actually started lengthening as my body sank down back towards the floor. The muscles, my triceps were still doing work, my biceps were doing work, but at the same time they were lengthening. This type of contraction is called an eccentric contraction. So this type of contraction usually builds more strength faster, but it also leads to increased soreness in the following days. So why does muscle lengthen during isotonic eccentric contractions? Well, remember that muscles are elastic. You have elastic filaments in the myofibril, and they permit your muscles to stretch. I experienced a third type of contraction when my trainer showed me how to do the farmer's walk exercise. During the farmer's walk, you hold heavy weights at your sides and you walk. Now, this isn't a picture of me, but hopefully you get an idea of what this looks like. The dumbbells that I had were just light enough that I didn't drop them, but they were so heavy, at least to me. My hands were aching, my forearms got sore, and the best I could do was muster an isometric contraction. In an isometric contraction, you generate tension in a muscle, but it doesn't lengthen and it doesn't shorten. I contracted my biceps and my triceps muscle so much that I could feel the tension I was generating, but it wasn't enough to lift the dumbbells up. And at the same time, what tension I did generate kept my muscles from lengthening, so I didn't actually wind up dropping the dumbbells. I just held them tightly at my sides. So my muscles basically stayed the same length while I carried the weights. You may have experienced the same type of contraction if you've ever loaded yourself up with as many grocery bags as possible to reduce how many times you had to go back to the car after a grocery shopping trip. So your three types of contractions are the isometric concentric contraction, where muscles provide enough tension or force to overcome a load, in this case a dumbbell, and these muscles are able to shorten as a result and do work. You had the isotonic eccentric contraction, where the muscles can't overcome the load, and instead of shortening, they actually lengthen. And then we have the isometric contraction, where the muscles generate tension while they're contracting, but the muscle neither lengthens and it doesn't shorten. My parents, by the way, used to have a book on their bookshelf that advertised you could tone up and firm your muscles using solely isometric exercises. Our ability to perform any work at all with our muscles is due in part to how our muscle fibers are organized into motor units, like you see on the right side of this slide. But equally important are the actual muscle fibers themselves. You see, there are multiple types of muscle fibers, but they can be grouped into two major categories: the type 1 muscle fibers and the type 2 muscle fibers. Muscles are made up of a combination of these two types, as you can see in this image here to the left. The main difference between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers is how they manage ATP. Type 1 muscle fibers synthesize large amounts of ATP by a process called aerobic cellular respiration. This ATP then supports muscle contraction. Remember the cross-bridge cycle? But type 2 fibers either use the ATP that's already in the muscle cell, or they use a couple of processes called glyconeogenesis and fermentation to synthesize ATP. Let's briefly review aerobic cellular respiration and fermentation, as they will help us make sense of the other differences between the type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. If we start out with glucose as an energy source, aerobic cellular respiration is the most efficient way that a human cell can make ATP. Aerobic cellular respiration is depicted on the left side of this slide. This process consists of three metabolic pathways: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, which is sometimes called the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation, which is sometimes called the electron transport chain, although that's not an accurate name for this process. In glycolysis, one molecule of glucose is split to form two molecules of pyruvic acid through 10 distinct chemical reactions. Along the way, a net of 2 ATPs are made and a molecule called NAD is reduced to make NADH. This happens 2 times. You can think of NADH as being future ATP. It isn't ATP yet, but it will be later. The pyruvic acids are further oxidized in the Krebs cycle. This produces more NADH. In fact, we're going to have 8 more by the time we're done with this process. It produces 2 ATPs, and by the end of the Krebs cycle, we're going to have 6 carbon dioxides. These are waste products that are made during the Krebs cycle. Every time you exhale, you're exhaling some carbon dioxide from this process. It's in the third pathway, oxidative phosphorylation, that the lion's share of ATP is made. Electrons and hydrogen atoms stripped from NADH and FADH2 are passed along a series of molecules called the electron transport chain. Energy that's released with each transfer of electrons and hydrogen atoms gets harnessed to synthesize 34 ATPs by the end of this process. But what happens to the electrons? The electrons get added to an oxygen molecule, and then hydrogen atoms get attached, or hydrogen ions rather get attached, and we make water. So this is going to help us get rid of the electrons. This is why oxygen is essential for aerobic cellular respiration. If there's no oxygen here, then the whole process stops and a cell dies. This is why when people, for example, have a stroke or they have a heart attack and blood flow to part of the brain or to the heart is blocked, the cells die because they do this aerobic cellular respiration, and without oxygen, the whole process stops. The cell can't make ATP and it dies. So by the time we add up the ATPs from glycolysis here, the ATPs from the Krebs cycle here, plus the 34 from the electron transport chain, that means that we're going to have a total of approximately 38 ATPs made from one glucose. This process needs oxygen, but it's slow because look at all the chemical reactions that have to happen in order for the process to go. On the right side of the slide is what happens with your type 2 fibers. Your type 2 fibers do fermentation. So that's this side of the slide. Fermentation is simply glycolysis plus a few extra steps. These extra steps help convert NADH here back into NAD because NAD is needed for glycolysis to happen. Only 2 ATPs are made per glucose. And notice that there's no oxygen required because there's no electron transport chain. That means that this process is anaerobic. Notice there's also no Krebs cycle. So a lot of that extra ATP that we made during aerobic cellular respiration doesn't get made here. Fermentation is a faster process because there are far fewer chemical reactions, but it's much less efficient at making ATP. Now let's look at our muscle fibers again. Type 1 fibers perform aerobic cellular respiration. These cells will have lots of mitochondria in them, and they'll have a high demand for oxygen. Oxygen gets to these cells from red blood cells flowing through our circulatory system. So type 1 fibers will have many tiny blood vessels called capillaries associated with them, bringing red blood cells and oxygen to the cell. Type 2 fibers, because they do fermentation, will have a comparatively few number of capillaries associated with them because these cells don't need all the oxygen that the type 1 fibers need. Myoglobin is a red-colored protein that stores oxygen. It's found only in muscle cells. It makes sense, therefore, that type 1 fibers will have high amounts of myoglobin in them, as they need that oxygen for aerobic cellular respiration. Type 2 fibers have very low amounts of myoglobin in them. Now, this relates to colors that are associated with these types of fibers. Since myoglobin is red, kind of like hemoglobin, your type 1 fibers are said to be red-colored cells because they have high amounts of myoglobin. Type 2 fibers, on the other hand, are said to be white-colored because they don't have the high amounts of myoglobin in them. Glycogen is a storage form of glucose. Since type 1 fibers are very efficient at converting glucose into ATP, and they have many capillaries that can bring glucose to the cell, they don't need to have a lot of glycogen in them, so their content will be very low. Type 2 fibers, on the other hand, are not efficient at converting glucose into ATP, and they have fewer capillaries bringing them nutrients like glucose. So this means that these cells will need to store high amounts of glycogen in them. The process of converting glycogen into glucose is called glyconeogenesis, and I suspect you'll learn more about that in Bio 234. Glycolytic ability refers to the reliance of muscle fibers on glycolysis for ATP production. For type 1 fibers that make most of their ATP in oxidative phosphorylation, the reliance on glucose is low, and these cells will not contain high amounts of glycolytic enzymes. Fermentation, on the other hand, is basically glycolysis plus a few extra steps, so your type 2 fibers will have many copies of the enzymes that perform glycolysis in them, and these cells will have a high reliance on glycolysis for making ATP. They'll have a high glycolytic ability, in other words. Muscle fatigue is the decrease in the production of force or power or tension due to previous contractile activity. And you've had this happen before, right? If you run for a long enough amount of time, it gets harder and harder to keep running, especially at the same speed you were running at initially. Your muscles get weaker as you use them, they get tired. All of that is what we mean when we say muscle fatigue. The two main contributors to fatigue are lack of ATP and the buildup of metabolic wastes like inorganic phosphates, lactic acid, and hydrogen ions. Since type 1 fibers can make a lot of ATP from only a little glucose, and they have many capillaries to transport wastes away from the cell, these muscle fibers have a higher resistance to fatigue. Type 2 fibers, on the other hand, because they are more likely to be ATP starved after enough contraction, and they have fewer capillaries to remove wastes, they have low fatigue resistance. Twitch rate refers to how quickly the cells can contract. If you think about what you saw on the last slide, aerobic cellular respiration is a long process. It has three metabolic pathways, and all of them have at least 10 steps. So it takes a long time to make that ATP. As a result, type 1 fibers contract more slowly than type 2 fibers. A contributing factor to twitch speed is the type of ATPase activity in the myosin proteins in these fibers. The myosin heads in the type 2 fibers break down ATP faster than the type that's found in your type 1 fibers. Finally, the diameter of your type 1 and type 2 fibers is different. If you look at the figure up here on the left side of your slide, you can see that this is the type 1 fiber here, and it's smaller than most of your type 2 fibers like these. Your type 2 fibers are responsible for faster, explosive, short duration movements like jumping, sprinting, and maybe lifting weights. These types of movements would require more myofibrils. Remember, those are those protein rods that have the sarcomeres in them. You would need more of those to accomplish these explosive, fast, impactful movements. So that leads to a larger diameter of the muscle fiber. Type 1 fibers are associated with slower, less explosive, but more sustained movements like running or swimming or dancing. So you would have fewer myofibrils, and the diameter of those muscle fibers would be smaller. During exercise or any movement really, your type 1 fibers are activated first. If they aren't strong enough to perform the movement, then type 2 fibers are recruited. Regular exercise can improve the efficiency and strength of type 1 and type 2 fibers. The principle of myoplasticity describes the changes in muscle structure as a result of change in function that's related to exercise. We are born with all of the myofibers that we will ever have. When our body functions normally, we don't grow any more muscle. Thus, muscle changes in response to exercise occur within the muscle fibers that we have. They don't change the number of actual fibers. Endurance training includes exercises that have highly repetitive movements but lighter loads, like long distance running, swimming, cycling, aerobics, things like that. This type of exercise leads to chemical changes inside of your cells, most dramatically in your type 1 fibers, but you'll see these changes also in the type 2. The changes include an increase in the amount of oxidative enzymes and mitochondria. So this means that the cells become even more efficient at converting glucose into ATP. You see increased fatigue resistance as a result. Cells also become more efficient at using fatty acids and non-glucose fuels for ATP production, probably because of those oxidative enzymes. And we also see increases in the number of blood vessels that supply the muscles. Resistance training or strength training includes those exercises that have fewer repetitions but heavier weights. This type of exercise causes primarily anatomical changes. We're going to see an increase in the number of myofibrils inside of the myocytes, and as a result, the diameter of the myocytes increases. This is called hypertrophy. So when someone goes to the gym and they start working out, and you gradually see that their muscles start growing, getting bigger, and poking out, that's hypertrophy. With hypertrophy comes a decrease in the proportion of mitochondrial proteins and blood supply to the muscle. It's not because you're losing mitochondrial proteins or blood vessels, it's just that the myocyte itself is getting larger. So the proportion changes. Unfortunately, this can decrease endurance. So to be healthiest and to have the best training for our muscles, we really need a balanced program that combines both endurance training and resistance training. So now we know that muscle fibers can improve their function as a result of exercise. But can exercise training help change the muscle fiber types? Well, it seems that exercise can cause muscle fibers to change their types. There's plenty of evidence that shows that the different types of muscle fibers that we call type 2, they can change from one type to another as long as they stay type 2. There's also some evidence that hints that type 1 fibers may be able to convert to type 2 and vice versa. But the jury is still out because the data is kind of muddy for that particular question. Right now, we know for sure that for someone who doesn't exercise, the ratio of type 1 to type 2 appears to be about 50-50. But for your elite athletes, the percentages can be quite different. For example, someone who is a marathoner may have a 70-30 ratio between type 1 and type 2. Someone who's a weightlifter may have the reverse. They may have 30-70. Disuse of muscles also leads to anatomical and biochemical changes, including a decrease in the number of myofibrils. This is why if you've been working out and then you stop after several months, your muscles go back to their normal size or to a smaller size. We also know that there can be a decrease in the oxidative enzymes, so the muscles become less efficient at converting glucose to ATP. These changes are called atrophy. The result is a decline in both strength and endurance. In other words, the old adage, use it or lose it, applies to skeletal muscle. Atrophy is a particular problem for people who are bedridden or those who have lost the use of their limbs. Perhaps you know someone who had to wear a cast on a leg or an arm for an extended period of time. They usually have to do some form of physical therapy to get their muscles supple, to build them up and to build their strength again after being immobilized. So this figure kind of summarizes what I've said over the last few slides. With endurance training, the diameter of our muscle fibers doesn't really change. The number of myofibrils inside basically stays the same. But what does change is we get an increase in the number of mitochondria and mitochondrial proteins. We also get an increase in the number of oxidative enzymes. This means that with endurance training, while the muscles don't change their shape anatomically, they do become more efficient at converting glucose to ATP. For resistance training, instead of getting that increase in the ability to convert glucose to ATP, we get anatomical changes. So we get an increase in the number of myofibrils. So remember, those contain the contractile units. So we get an increase in that. Proportionally, there's a decrease in the number of blood vessels because the myofiber is getting bigger. Okay, and we will see decreased oxidative enzymes. With disuse, we get atrophy. So notice that the size, the diameter of this myofiber is much smaller than this one because there's a decrease in the number of, or the size rather, of the myofibrils. There's a decrease in the number of myofibrils, and you get a decrease in the amount of oxidative enzymes. So that means that these muscles become less and less efficient at converting glucose to ATP. So now we've reached the end of the video, and we've talked about the differences between your isometric and isotonic contractions. Remember, with isotonic, you're generating tension, but at the same time, the length of a muscle changes. This is in contrast to the isometric, where while generating tension, the length of the muscle stays the same. We've also talked about the two different types of muscle fibers. I will tell you that there are the type 1 and then there's the type 2. And in the type 2, you have subgroups of muscle fibers. We didn't really talk about the subgroups because I don't think it's so important for where we are right now, but you should be able to distinguish between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers as described in this video. The last thing we talked about was the effect of endurance exercises versus resistance exercises on your muscle fibers. And then we talked a little bit about what happens when you don't exercise at all. I hope this video was helpful to you. The information in this video could show up on your exam, especially the differences between the types of muscle fibers and contractions. In the next video, we'll look at how your muscles make energy while they're working, and we'll talk about what happens after you stop exercising. I'll see you in that video, and I'll be glad to finally stop talking about muscle.